The Security Weekly News is live on Tuesdays and Fridays at 12 o'clock Eastern Time most every week. I try to scan and produce a quick look at some major stories to help you keep up with what's going on in and around the industry in a short format. Myself, Jason Wood, and other guest commentators provide greater insight every week. I'm Doug White, and I hope that you will look for the Security Weekly News in all of your favorite podcast catchers and subscribe for the latest content.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. We've got everyone but Josh. Well, Ed had to drop.
Dropping like flies.
We put Josh in timeout.
Josh in timeout. He'll be back for the news
We got
segment.
Sam, Tyler,
Timeout.
Jeff, Matt, and Larry, and of course myself, talking about vulnerability management and vulnerability disclosure. And I want to talk about something that I listened to recently. Whitey Cracker. His real name is Bryce. And Josh knows. Of course, Josh isn't on the segment when I talk about him. Josh is like,
He's yelling at us from the other room.
yeah. So he did an interview with a podcast called The Sean Ryan Show. This is like I think it's like a Joe Rogan style show is my assessment. I just started listening. And the reason I started listening is because I saw some of his clips on Instagram and he was interviewing hackers. So he's interviewed Ryan Montgomery and Whitey Cracker. And so I started listening to really just those two episodes of the Sean Ryan Show because I'm like, oh, they're talking to hackers. Like, I like listening to episodes with hackers. Good interviews.
Not as good as yours.
Of course. I mean, I'm biased though.
Just so everybody knows.
But the interviews are good, and but also I like it because they're doing a good. So both Ryan and Bryce have done a great job of representing the hacker and cybersecurity community. I think on like a non-cybersecurity show, which I think is important, right?
Oh,
like
yeah.
Dave Kennedy goes on the news, and so they're doing a good job of doing that. Now, both of them kind of have like a little shady past, like a kind of like gray hat, black hat stuff, that happened in the past, which I'm not sure paints a great picture of what hackers are. So there is that. But overall, I thought it was good. One of the things that Bryce is talking about is website defacements. So back in the day, you remember attrition.org would track, and there was another site. It was like the Turkish were big on website defacements. What was it? Tyler, Larry, do you guys remember?
Yeah.
It was attrition would track all the website defacements, but there was another site, now that I think of it, that would track website defacements, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. But Bryce also created what was his forum that he created? Digital Gangsters was his forum. And Digital Gangsters were responsible for Paris Hilton sidekick hack. Remember that? Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Barack Obama's Twitter account hack, and a couple other like big hacks like that. That's how got their claim to fame. And they did a lot of other stuff. But one of the things that Bryce was big on was doing defacements. He's like, look, basically I found this vulnerability in IIS. And I could probably go back and pinpoint it to like a very specific vulnerability. Like I remember the vulnerability that he was talking about.
Yep.
And he was like, so I would just write a scanner. I would go out and I would find a site and it was vulnerable. And I would determine that it was vulnerable. And I would try and find the person responsible for the site. And I would write them. And I would say, hey, look, like your website's vulnerable. You should fix it. And he's like, damn near 100% of the time, I'd get no response. And so then I would go and deface the website, right? He's like, I didn't get any money from it. Like he didn't say that, but like there was no like transaction. There was no ransomware. There was no blackmailing. It was just like, I defaced the site. Like I put up an image of like, hey, like hacked by Whitey Cracker or blah, blah, blah. Like go fix your stuff. And then they would fix their website. So we've got this, we talked about ethics in the last segment too. Like, now I'm kind of, listening to this, I'm kind of conflicted, right? Because I'm like, you tried to do the right thing and help the person, but they didn't. So you deface the site. But the end result was they actually fixed their site after you defaced it. Now, you didn't just do this for ISPs and some businesses. You also did this for NASA and a bunch of other government agencies, which now the spotlight starts shining on you, and you start being investigated by a lot of three-letter government agencies.
Yep.
And I think it was one of the things that led to, he's like, basically they were ready to kick in my door, and I cooperated, And amazingly, I think back then he said like the agencies actually talked to each other, and he's like, I cooperated, and he didn't have to do any jail time or prison time, but he had to pay restitution and was on probation for a long time. Right?
You couldn't do that now.
You could not.
That would not work out.
Probably would not work out in your favor now. So I'm not suggesting that you do that. I'm just recounting what has happened in the past to Tyler, to your point, and it's a great point.
But you couldn't do that now.
You could do that now, but you might go to prison.
No, but you couldn't do that now and get away with it. But what still ends up happening is that somebody finds a vulnerability in XYZ. And they go to the manufacturer and say, hey, XYZ, I found a vulnerability in your stuff. And they're like, go fuck yourself.
Right.
So now what happens is that person takes that vulnerability in XYZ and tries again and says, hey, we've got a vulnerability in your stuff. And they tell you to go fuck yourself. So that person then releases that vulnerability, that exploit to the internet as a whole without any responsible disclosure, because they tried the responsible disclosure route and it didn't work. And now anybody can deface the site.
Right.
And this
how is that different?
It's not, and I agree with you, Larry. This is a problem with companies.
I think we all agree that Tyler's a little
hot.
Sorry, Tyler. I'm really sorry, but when you came on the mic, you were so loud in our headphones.
So hot, baby.
So hot.
You are so hot, Tyler.
And it's not just your voice. All right, sorry, Tyler, start again.
I was gonna say, am I?
You're better now.
You're better. Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, you're good.
Continue.
No, I was gonna say this is the problem with companies that are not getting on board with bug bounties or responsible disclosure paths, or being mature enough to have even a channel and or be receptive. Even if you don't have a bug bounty, your company's not on board with that, have a means for being receptive to researchers and people that reach out with disclosure or vulnerabilities and paying attention to that. Because if you do not, the problem is there's not a real great path forward for the researchers. There's a lot of risk on the researchers when they see something and try to disclose it. That's a cagey and very delicate dance that happens. But if we do not disclose it, someone else will find that. Like, it's not just the fact that we stumbled across this one-off. Like, yes, sometimes it's a little bit tricky to do some of the bugs, but people are looking at these things. So you must make sure that you are open to those discussions and you properly handle and take care of the researchers. Otherwise, it ends up going the exact opposite way. And I can tell you, having been on both sides of that receiving end, it is not fun on the researcher side, and it gets very tricky from an ethics standpoint for how you then move forward. Well, you put us in,
what
in a very
what are the
bad
ethics of you try a couple times, 2, 3, however many you think, whatever's appropriate to notify a vendor or a manufacturer or company, and they don't listen, they don't respond, and then you make it public. What's the ethics of, well, the next course of action is make it public? I'm not sure I don't
I'm typically agree
making
with that
leap immediately.
Unless it is serious enough that it puts the general public and or say financial safety, whatever, at harm, and no one is doing something about it. What are your options? I would not definitely go public for my next option, but that is again a personality thing.
But I think that's something to drill into. What are the potential other options? And when you just say, I did the right thing, I told them, and then just move on and let the chips fall as they fall.
I mean, you could try and remain anonymous and sell the exploit, but there's ethical.
Yeah, but I mean,
there's there's an ethical dilemma there too that we've debated on the show in the past, and we look at folks like Charlie Miller that have talked about this. Okay, I discovered something. Maybe I tried to disclose it or I didn't, but I'm going to sell it, and I'm going to sell it to a nation state, whether it's the U.S. or some other nation state, and what they do with it. I'm absolving all moral and ethical, I'm washing my hands of it like I developed it, I sold it. Whatever everyone else does with it afterwards is up to them. And you could come back to the hammer analogy of I created a hammer and I sold the hammer to people. And some people use it to build housing for homeless people, but other people use it to bash people over the head and murder people. And that's not my responsibility. I created a tool. I sold it. You do with what you will.
But I guess the question for me, Tyler, comes down to: I find a vulnerability in a website or a vulnerability, and I disclose it. They don't do anything about it, and this boils back to the conversation we had kind of in the first opening segment around responsibility and accountability and liability, right? And so if it's an individual company and they don't do anything about it, I guess the question becomes like, do I go to the manufacturer? Because let's say it's a WordPress vulnerability, right? Is it the company's responsibility? Is it WordPress responsibility? Like, vulnerability disclosure gets really interesting because in some cases you're going to the company and saying, hey, by the way, I saw your website's hackable. I found this vulnerability. You should fix it. And they don't fix it. But is it their issue or is it actually somebody else's issue?
Could be.
And so how do you think about disclosure when it comes to the individual company versus the manufacturer versus whatever the underlying source code is to do this? And that's where it gets really interesting, right?
First step, respond and communicate. I mean, even if it is through your general counsel or legal, let them know this is being looked at rather than ghosting a researcher. I'm going to tell you right now, no matter how you play that out, if you ghost a researcher, it's either getting sold or getting disclosed.
Right.
So don't ghost them. Like, start with some communication, be a good human, and at least at a minimum, let them know that something's being looked at.
And, and for the
also,
record,
I think,
disclosed outside of your control.
Yeah, because also I think you're ignorant to the fact in this case of other people are going to find it. Just because one person found it and you ignore them doesn't mean someone else isn't going to find it. And everyone's moral and ethical scale, especially in this sense, is vastly different.
Oh, of course.
So the next person
and their patriotic reliance is not always to a friendly nation state or government in which you think is patriotic. So like, it's probably in the best interest for all democratic countries of origin or NATO to respond and or make sure that someone is looking at this. I mean, there's other channels. You have CERT, you've got DHS, CISA if you're in the United States, and or it falls in the purview of public-private negotiations. Like, CISA will take on some responsibility and ensure that people comply to certain aspects. And then there's regulatory bodies.
But that begs, is that a logical next step if you try to reach out to the vendor yourself as a researcher, don't get anywhere? Is there, and you happen to be in the U.S., could you just go let CISA know and let them deal with it, and that be a next step before disclosure?
In fact, I would almost do that depending on the vulnerability and how serious it is and the widespread nature of it. I mean, if you want to talk about the AMI stuff that Eclipsium did, and when we were looking at how prolific this was across multiple manufacturers downstream in an OEM supply chain, like, CISA had to be involved, and they had to coordinate some of those efforts in order to get to the right level at those manufacturers downstream, as well as coordinate efforts with AMI. And that whole process was very, very well done. And that was only because CISA was involved and they had the weight to throw around. So yeah, I would think about what the implications are on the supply chain and how bad this is for the public, and base your decision on that.
So the impact weighs into as one of those factors.
It does, but I'm thinking through the process, right? And I think, Tyler, you laid this out pretty well. I go to the manufacturer. I disclose a vulnerability. They do nothing about it. My next step in the U.S. anyways is probably go to CISA and say, look, we found this vulnerability. The vendor's not responding. We don't know the broad impact of this. Like, is that is that the process? Like, you go to the vendor. If you get a response, great, good. Right? They know.
Well,
they got
not always.
The vendor has a responsibility to do something with that. And if they're not able to do it because of resource or budget, or the impact goes beyond what they're capable of handling, I would argue that in some cases, there are places where you go around the vendor or coordinate direct communications through someone like this. If they don't have a bug bounty program, they're not receptive to researchers. Maybe they respond, but they're not set up to handle CVE numbers and they don't know what the process is. You actually want someone in there on your side from a liability standpoint as a researcher batting for you. So I would argue in some cases you want to go directly to places like NIST or DHS, CISA, and ensure that the right people are prioritizing this while keeping your top coverage and liability to a minimum, because like I said, if
So
they don't
I-
have bug bounty programs, there's some delicate dances that if you've not done this before, it gets messy.
Is there room? I mean, I was thinking the same thing, Tyler, but I was thinking maybe that should be the first step regardless. Why not immediately, if you discover a vulnerability as a researcher, go to the government organizations and sort of turn it over to them to deal with it?
If you want to talk
rather than
about
trying
how
to
that
go to the vendors.
Yeah, how that plays out, like that's exactly right. And I think we're getting to the point where that is becoming a thing where there's even incentives, monetary incentives for some of this. But this is how China works now. As a private industry, a private security researcher, as anybody in the general public, if you do not disclose the vulnerability to the government first and provide them with insight, or knowingly find something and don't give it to the government immediately, you're actually breaking the law and can be put in prison.
So I think this is a really interesting dynamic, and I think that researchers need to understand, like, from a liability, right? We talked about responsibility, accountability, liability. As a researcher, you want to limit your liability in some respects if you're ethical, right? If you're ethical, you want to be like, whoa, I found this. I want to do the right thing, and so the right thing is to limit my liability. Go to CISA. Right? First, and let CISA kind of run this through the process. I think if you're not ethical and you go to the vendor first and then you could sell it on the side, like you almost know the track that the researcher's going down potentially based on which path they go down. So you almost have to bucket the researchers into these buckets of, if I'm ethical, I go to CISA, let CISA kind of deal with it. If I'm not, maybe I go to the vendor directly, maybe get a payment. If I don't get a payment, then maybe I open this out on the environment. And like, to me, that's true tell, like how disclosures potentially happen.
Well, I think this is some of the, I wish we had invited Casey Ellis to this discussion, actually.
Oh,
I feel bad that we didn't invite Casey because his insights on this.
Well, he's sleeping
than-
right about now.
No, he's on the west. He's on the west coast.
Morning. It's almost morning. He's in Australia, I think, still,
No.
right?
He spends a lot of time in the States, too. He's got he's in
He's kind of back and
California.
forth,
Yeah.
so.
Let me ask him. Go ahead, keep talking.
Yeah, I know. I feel bad we
Blow
didn't.
up his phone right now.
Where are you, Ray?
We didn't. Yeah, Ed was the only guest that we brought on in tradition. So
Let's just dial them in.
we should just
Phone
dial
a-
in
phone a
Casey right
friend.
now. I should just call him. We should just call him on my phone.
It just depends on where he
Cold
is.
call
If he's,
him.
if
Cold
he's
call
going
him.
under,
Casey,
he's sleeping.
Casey, you're on Paul
You're on
Security
the air.
Weekly. Yeah.
Where are you? Casey, are you in the States or are you
Answer
in
this
Australia?
question and you win $3,000.
But I think this is one of the benefits to a bug bounty program, that if a company does have a bug bounty program, it incentivizes researchers to go, I found this bug. Whether or not you want a payment or not, or a t-shirt or whatever the incentive is,
Right.
having a bug bounty program is a facility and a process for them to respond. If they're using a company, reputable company like BugCrowd helps facilitate this conversation and helps validate the vulnerability, right? Helps with the back and forth that happens sometimes. Is this a bug? Is it not a bug? What's the impact? What's the severity? If there's dispute, BugCrowd helps with that process, which I think is extremely valuable in these types of situations. Also, if there is a payout, I've discovered a vulnerability. They go, oh, they have a bug bounty program. Like, oh, they're going to pay me $10,000.
Cool.
Like, you know what? I'm going to go directly to the company through their bug bounty program, fill out all the paperwork, do the thing, and maybe I get 10 grand. Great.
But you've got to
Awesome.
have a process flow as a researcher to
Yes.
think about, like, okay, I found a vulnerability. Does the vendor have a bug bounty program? Yes or no? Yes, disclose to them. No? Shit, where do I go next?
Right.
Like,
Yes.
that's almost the mentality these researchers have to have, Paul, in order to protect themselves from a liability
But
perspective.
do we really want the litmus test to be a financial?
No,
No.
that's part of
Criteria.
it.
It's
It shouldn't
part
be
of
the
it.
only.
It shouldn't be the only
it shouldn't
mechanism.
but not the primary. I mean, I know there's a lot of researchers out there that this is kind of how they make a living,
I know.
but that's not all of them.
Look, some of these bug bounty programs paid out a ton of money. So look, there's a monetary aspect to this, Tyler, as you know, right? There are, Microsoft's paid out over $30 million in bug bounties or something like that. I just saw a report on this. It was an article that popped up. I don't cover on my show, but I'm like, they paid out like over $30 million in bug bounties, right? So there is definitely a monetary aspect to this, but it can't be just monetary because there is a liability component to this that I think researchers have to understand.
Casey's in London, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
So he's still
so
awake.
he's definitely. Oh, he's still awake.
He's still awake.
Still a little
He's a
late.
night owl.
But you've got to think through this kind of decision matrix tree of bug bounty, no bug bounty. What do I do if they don't have a bug bounty? Like,
Is he near a computer with Zoom on it?
I think a lot of that relies on the company and their communication, to their approach to the researcher and how they handle, communicate, and interact with the researcher, as well as are they trying to do the right things. Like I don't always want money for a vulnerability. In fact, most of the time I give them away unless it is something I feel can help a government during an ongoing operation that may be particularly suited for a hotbed area of interest for a government entity, right?
Of course you
there are
would.
cases that those are very
but
helpful.
also, but I come back to my tool analogy. If I'm developing a tool and I sell said tool, I hope that using it in an ethical manner to forward operations for a country that's doing the right thing, right? I don't know that. In a lot of those situations, Tyler, there's no assurance of that, right? You don't know. But I don't know. I didn't sell it to the enemy. So there's that, like, kind of, you got that going for you in that ethical dilemma, right? I didn't go sell it to an enemy nation state. I didn't put it out there for the public for everyone to use. But also there's something to be said for that too.
Casey's willing to join.
Get him on Zoom. Send him a Zoom. Can we get
Somebody get me a Zoom
Renee,
link that I
can
can
you
pass to
send
him.
Casey Ellis a Zoom link,
Or give it to
the
me,
show?
Give it to
Whoever.
Jeff.
Jack, and I'll give it to him.
Well, yep.
We're gonna do this live.
We're going to do this live.
Well, because
We're going to do it in production.
when we were talking about like what a company, if you're the manufacturer, the vendor in the case, what should you do? Should you have a bug bounty program? Should you not have a bug bounty program? Fine, like that's up to you. But what is your process for triaging?
Base minimum, responsible
Casey's
disclosure.
one of the founding members of Disclose.io, which provides a free facility for you to develop that process, right? I mean, that's how passionate Casey and many others that we know that are involved with Disclose.io are about this, right? There should be a process.
Because over the years, like this has went very, very wrong for many of us in multiple cases, in multiple ways,
Dude,
right?
yeah.
Like,
Okay, let's talk about 20 years ago and earlier. Let's just all come down to the fact that it was a hot mess. Like the further back we go in history,
The worse it was.
the
Well, I
worse
mean,
of a
yeah.
hot mess disclosure was. We've come a long way.
You've come a long way, baby.
But I also
in
think there was a
disclosure.
bell curve there, right? Like at least in the beginning, when you disclose stuff or you provided some of that information, you didn't have as much potential to go to federal pound me in the ass prison, like straight out of the gate, right? Like,
I think that's called the gulag.
I was thinking about how
depending on which
horrible it must
country
be
you're
to
in,
be in
yeah.
prison in China. My brain can't really like.
They don't go to
like,
prison.
Get
They
a
just
hold of.
freaking execute them. Like, come
Or
on.
or it could be
Come
that.
on.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that might be better
Paul,
than going
they
to
just-
prison
they
in
just
Russia or China.
disappear. Like,
Tyler, what does
Russia-
federal pound me in the ass prison look like in China? Do you have enough
I can't
flair on
say
your
that.
jacket? No, do you have enough flair on your jacket? Like, oh, geez.
oh my god.
yeah, I don't know. Like the ability for us, the bell curve in which we've come full circle, where you have some serious liability as a researcher if you are doing bug bounty and there's no responsible disclosure path, and or you end up getting access or finding a very critical bug, your liability personally. And if the company doesn't play nice and they have a lot of money or resources, like this is one that I've ended up on the other side of. Like you find a very large company,
Oh my God.
big,
I love-
far-reaching.
I love how we can like pull at the strings on the internet and get Casey Ellis on the show.
Casey.
And boom, we've got a magic Casey Ellis.
Casey, you there? I think he's frozen. Oh wait, Casey, you there?
There he is.
Hey,
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Hey,
Hey,
Casey.
what's up, buddy? How are you?
I saw that.
Oh, his connection's really bad.
Oh, no.
No.
damn terrorists.
Damn terrorists, Tyler. Better, maybe.
Better maybe now. Casey, you there?
Testing
must-
one,
you
two,
must
three.
be in a
Testing one,
hotel.
2, 3.
That's better.
What's up, man? You heard that we were talking about you, so you just decided to join the show. I love it.
It just happens. It's like saying Candyman in front of the mirror.
Right.
Owner friend Casey Ellis is here.
Casey, I can't thank you enough for joining. And we're talking about something that you and I have talked about, I think both on air and off air, right? In this disclosure process where we sit and what you do as a researcher when you find a vulnerability and you disclose it to a company. And let's play the scenario out. They say nothing, right? I gave the example earlier in the segment of Whitey Cracker, who would deface a bunch of websites, like find them were vulnerable, write people, get nothing back, and then deface the website, and then the website gets fixed. And I'm like, is that really where we are? So like, what do you do when you disclose a vulnerability to a company and they say nothing? I get this question so often, I'm sure you do too, Casey, from security researchers across the globe that are finding these vulnerabilities go, I don't know what to do. I got nothing in response.
Yeah, no, I mean, like in an ideal world, you'd have, companies like at the very least setting out a vulnerability disclosure policy and a clear, channel for intake through like security TXT or whatever else. And obviously, vendors like BugCrowd and others like working with us to make that easy. So there's the small, I think growing, but still kind of small part of the internet for which that's true and it's easy. I think for everyone else, yeah, it gets kind of hard. I mean, you've got the time honored tradition of tapping folk like myself or people that are known in the industry for helping out with this type of thing and saying, hey, how do I get this done? Then there's the ability to go to like CertCC and some of the kind of the various kind of government certs around the place. There's basically this like increasingly crappy set of things that are possible as a way to get the information into the right hands, including at the end of it all, going full disclosure and defacing a website. So
right,
there isn't one single good answer to it yet, right?
Do you guys provide some of that liability top coverage for those researchers and providing those paths and connections through the network in order to get the information to the right people with the right amount of top coverage? I mean, we were talking earlier about like this has gotten messy for us and in a lot of the researchers out there that we've been on the other receiving end of this. And so doing this right takes a lot of experience and navigating it.
I mean,
a lot of work.
Yeah, part of my point of view of this is that I've been on the receiving end of this too. So like I'm hearing you, and definitely I think the experience of the last 10 years of brokering this stuff through BugCrowd's definitely informed and kind of driven some of where I've gotten to today. Like in that case, like your point, Tyler, is a really good one. Like if I have someone reach out to me and say, hey, because the other thing that happens, like it might not be I don't know who to contact. It might be I found this thing that's a little bit scarier than I thought it would be. And like someone who isn't me accidentally, interneted the thing. And now I'm concerned about that. And I actually want top cover in trying to get that information into the right hands. So, I think for a lot of the folk that have helped broker those conversations in the past and still today, I know it's something certainly that I do, is to give the researcher the option for basically, anonymity in that process. So to reach out and say, hey, listen, like theoretically, if someone had found this, like who's the right person to get it to? I believe this is a real risk, but they're concerned that you're going to interpret this as someone trying to hack you for real. Based on my own opinion of the situation, I don't believe that that's what's going on here, but I want to make sure that we're on the same page before I connect you guys directly, because that's something that we want to try to avoid as well, right?
Yeah.
Do you also leverage like government agencies like DHS, CISA, and provide some of the enforcement arm or the branch where those discussions then have implications and have follow-on and have the ability to ensure that those conversations, if the impact matches, are appropriately had?
It depends. The answer is yes, that's always available. The real answer is that those guys get kind of busy because, I think the amount of vulnerability research going on and the number of people trying to like solve this particular problem has like increased dramatically over the past 10 years. So they end up with a signal to noise and just a pure kind of logistics problem. So
Well, that and it's government. Just saying.
It's got well, look, I mean, they're good at things like scale. When technology is the thing that defines scale, is not necessarily one of those things. So part of how I've always thought about that is that if it involves critical infrastructure, then yeah, that's a good candidate for taking it to CISA DHS or to CertCC, any one of those other organizations that can provide that top cover, but also that whole like, hey, we're from the government.
Yeah, we might have lost him.
Yeah, right at the here we're from the government part.
Right.
We're here to help, is what he was going to say.
All right.
We're here to scare you.
Yeah. So Casey, what I was trying to
Right.
walk through is like, what does a normal process flow? What should a normal process flow look
What
like?
should?
I'm a researcher. I find a vulnerability. Do I go to the vendor
Yep.
first and get a response or no response, then go to a bug crowd, or do I go to a government entity? Like, I'm trying to figure
what's
out,
the
like,
idea?
It sounds like it's a decision tree.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I
When
know.
do I go to the
right? When
vendor
do I
first?
go? And when do I
When
pull
do
in
I
a
go to the
bug
government?
crowd versus a government entity? And how do I manage this process flow? Because I think that's a challenge for researchers. They find a
Agreed.
vulnerability, like, okay, I found one. It's big. Like, what do I
now
do?
what?
Like, now what? Right? Do I go to
ChatGPT.
you? Do I go to the gov? Do I go to the vendor? Like, what's that flow look like?
Yeah, the first thing is always to try to find out if the vendor or if the target, so like not necessarily a vendor, maybe it's a government organization or entity, it could be any one of a whole bunch of things. Do they have an established contact point? Because many will, not all do, and that's kind of where this all goes, a lot more kind of complicated and pear-shaped. But what we've seen is this is the whole reason behind the Disclose.io project, is to basically make that part more common, more kind of simple to establish, and frankly have it not in any way kind of reliant on whether or not they become a bug crowd customer, because this is not a commercial problem. This is like, if your shit's broken and someone finds it, they need to be able to tell you. Like, how do we solve that top level problem? Because that is for the better part, the hard part.
But
you're just out there on internet safari as a researcher, right?
I don't think we're trying to overtly endorse bug crowd, but I don't mind doing that because I love you guys.
Appreciate it.
But to what degree does bug crowd offer? You mentioned brokering earlier on. Does bug crowd have like a bug crowd CISA hotline? Like you know what the channels are, you know who to contact and reach out. Is bug crowd, as an example, a viable step in the decision tree? Do I contact the vendor? Do I contact the government directly, or do I engage a third party like bug crowd that's in the business of
Casey,
doing this type of stuff?
can you just give everyone your phone number so when we find bugs we can just call you?
I can do that.
That's it. Well, yeah, you could, but then it would probably.
But I won't.
Jeff just did.
Okay, let's not do that. Let's hope we have a better process.
I said I could. I didn't say I would.
Yeah, look, I mean, what I would say, so Disclose, which is it's basically an open source kind of not-for-profit thing that was spawned, beside bug crowd, like bug crowd doing the commercial, like, let's help people run these programs from an operational standpoint more effectively. Like Disclose.io was like, okay, all the other just internet-y stuff that needs to happen to make this all work at a system level, like how can we facilitate those things at the same time? So, if bug crowd gets a call from a researcher on something that they're wanting help with, we definitely jump in and assist. Where we actually point people, there's a forum at community.disclose.io, where basically you can post there and say, hey, I need an assist on getting into contact with the right people at a particular organization. Either they're non-responsive or they have an established VDP intake channel and they're not being responsive there. Or there's just like, I just don't know who the hell owns this thing and I don't know who to contact and it's really bad. I want to see it get fixed. So that's one area where people go for that. Frankly, like the decentralization of how this problem ends up getting solved is a part of the reason why there isn't really a central answer to that question. You know what I mean? Like most of the time it does end up being a game of telephone tag to wake the right person up and get them to pay attention to the particular issue that's been found. and to make sure that they're taking the finder seriously, because the other side of this is that you've got to remember, with bug bounty, with a lot of researchers that have popped up over the past 5 or 6 years who get a 11 out of 10 for enthusiasm, but maybe a 3 out of 10 for usefulness. Like, there is a signal to noise problem that people have to deal with on the receiving end. It's not always like trying to triage and work out what you're listening to and what you aren't is hard as well.
Casey, I want to ask you about that because we did an interview a while ago that will finally air early next year for Hacker Heroes, right? But since then, like this year, we've talked about a lot of what I would describe as FUD around bug bounties. And I think I've done not a great job at dispelling some of this FUD. And there are some researchers that are like really vocal about bug bounties are crap, like poo-poo bug bounties. And I'm like, ah. Then I talked to Jared DeMott that also helped level set some of that stuff. And he's like, look, that's really like 1% of the, we talk about Microsoft
it's just your opinion, man.
Yeah. And 1% of the time, Jared DeMott's like, yeah, there's going to be some debate and we're open to talking to researchers about that. And I'm like, a lot of this is really just FUD. And I think it was multiple articles we covered and Jared coming on the show and really like opening the curtain, being like, I'm fully transparent. Here's what happens at Microsoft. They brought me around to like, it's really just a miscommunication and a lot of FUD of people that had a bad experience with bug bounties. And I think you've experienced this probably throughout your entire career creating bug crowd. And it's kind of a thorn in your side. So I wanted to give you the platform to kind of dispel a lot of this FUD that I don't think I've done it justice.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking, when you think about what we're doing here, it's a business that's built entirely on top of unintended consequence. Right? Yeah. So the fact that it comes in cold and there's a difficulty in communication, or there's like a negative initial, whatever it might be, or someone comes in hot and like gets ranty, or like there's all sorts of different stories out there of when this stuff goes wrong. What doesn't get talked about is when it goes right,
which is most of the time, right?
Yeah. And I think given the subject matter, we are hackers. I mean, this is the story of hackers that goes back decades, right? Like it's far easier to propagate a story about what we're doing that has a negative association with it, because it's an easier story to tell, and it gets wings and travels around the world more quickly than one that's a little bit more boring but has ended up with a better outcome.
Yeah, so, all we got to do is
to me that's an occupational hazard that I've worked with for the last years doing this.
Right,
and it's not really a new thing, but
Yeah, the worst scenario is we name the vulnerability and it gets news coverage.
No, the worst is you get a
holy
logo.
Cow.
You got to have a logo
and a theme song.
Logo.
Yeah, it gets a logo, and then all of a sudden it becomes the nightly news, and it's like, wait, is it really that bad? Is it that bad? Is it really? But that's what we've come to as a society in some respects, right? As soon as we name the vulnerability, oh my gosh, like
it's arguably easier to wave your genitals around and make a splash than it is to do the right thing.
Wow. But also,
if you're male,
where I was going though is also I think it's a leadership and like relationship concept that I think Michael Santarcangelo brought to light, and that is most relationships fail because of unmet expectations. And I think in these cases where researchers are being very vocal about having a bad experience, is this really just unmet expectations on either side? The researcher had this expectation that, like everything's going to go my way. This is like they're going to see things exactly as I see it. And when that doesn't happen, their expectations aren't met. And therefore they're like, well, this relationship is crap and all bug bounties are crap. And I'm like, no, that's not true.
That's spot on. I think, Paul, one of the first times that you and I met IRL would have been DerbyCon 2014, I think it was. I gave a talk there called The Unlikely Romance. And what I was trying to unpack was kind of some of the early things that we discovered around what is actually make this work effectively and what some of the predictable traps look like. And that is one of them. The idea of, basically like a golden rule of definitely bug bounty, but I think it goes down to vulnerability research and vulnerability disclosure programs where there isn't any kind of reward involved as well. Like align expectations as best you possibly can before you start. So as an organization, like the ideal state is as an organization who's willing to receive this type of feedback and even willing to start to solicit it. What you've also got to do is say, okay, this is what it's going to look like, and whatever kind of blur you leave in that, you're basically leaving up to the interpretation of folks that might be well intentioned on the outside, but they're not necessarily thinking about what you have to think through as a business on your end, right? So they're coming in as researchers that actually genuinely want to help, but they might have, it might be a 15-year-old who just, read a bunch of stories about what Tavis has done, over the years with full disclosure, and think that the right thing for them to do is go and drop this on Twitter and blow it up in front of the press, because that's just what you need to do, right? Like, they don't necessarily understand that there's a lot of nuance behind that decision. That sort of failure mode can happen really easily when you consider the fact that this is like every potential security researcher on the internet that we're talking about that's now in your audience. So the smart thing to do on the receiving side is say, okay, this is how it's going to work. These are the things that we're going to commit to. And then, basically once you've done that, your job is then to follow through, to make sure that you actually commit, do the things that you commit to, and you build trust, between your organization and security research community as a whole over time. There's so much, like, I use romantic analogies probably way more often than I should. But, there's a lot of stuff that actually pretty directly applies and translates.
Is there such a thing, Casey, or anybody, as like for the researchers, in the spirit of trying to eliminate some of the noise and the FUD, a rules of engagement, a checklist, self-analysis? You've discovered a vulnerability. Let me review some things that will help me make a determination of the responsible disclosure path. Part of the decision tree. Do I try to contact the vendor? Do I go right to the government? Do I go to
or how to disclose the vulnerability? So Jared,
if and how and when, is there some sort of rules of engagement or manifesto that is guidance for? Not everybody's going to follow it. I understand that, but is there something that's documented that is guidelines for how to approach it?
Jared DeMont from Microsoft came on and said that it was evangelizing that people go read Microsoft's how to disclose a bug documentation, because we put a lot of effort into documenting. Hey, if you found a bug in some kind of Microsoft product or service, here's how we want you to describe it for us. It's like, you'll be astounded at how many people just don't read that or misinterpret that.
Right.
It's like, if you're going to disclose bugs,
something
you
like
should go
that,
read that.
But
now, Casey, I'm sure you at BugCrowd you have
Microsoft.
Similar documentation and training. I know you do for folks that are participating in BugCrowd-based bug bounties, right? So I think, Jeff, your answer is you got to go RTFM.
But I want to hear Casey answer it, not
Casey,
you, Paul.
Describe that. Sorry. I'll shut up now.
Shut up.
I'm shutting up.
No, I think Paul did a pretty good job there. I mean, I think
Stop.
Paul did a shit job. We want to hear from Casey.
Even if you say the same thing.
I know. I didn't mean to steal your thunder. Sorry.
Even if you praise Paul, it's okay.
Look, I think so. Microsoft's version of this stuff is going to be specific to Microsoft. Mm-hmm. They've got very particular, it's a vast organization, diverse, attack surface, all those different things, but is still one organization with one kind of operational thesis around how they receive and work with vulnerabilities. And that's great. I think, they've done a lot when it comes to leadership and education in this space. Same goes for Google and others. Challenge is it's not representative. Like, there's not actually that many companies in the world that look like Microsoft or Google. Mm. So, the question becomes, like, how do you teach people how to do this in a way that basically covers as much of the potential attack surface, like, globally as you possibly can? And that's a lot of how, when BugCrowd's tried to educate us, that's how we've tried to think about it. Because, the other side of it is the incredible diversity you've got across the research community at this point, right? Like, we've got kind of the generation that we're all in and that we've kind of come from. Then there's, the more recent generation that kind of kicked off with the whole bug bounty hunting thing. There's this enormous spectrum of, call it, understanding of the problem that they're actually solving. Like, some are very sophisticated, some just think it's 100% about the bug. And like the latter, you've got to really take them through and say, hey, like, it's not just about that. You're actually here to solve a problem. Like, how do we frame it up in that context. Because if you can at least have some understanding of the fact that this is a conversation, not just you being right and trying to have someone agree with that, it's going to go a lot further, because communication, is a key to effectively solving the problem, right?
Okay, Sam,
then you got stuff like English is a second language. That's another huge thing. You got people coming in that don't necessarily they're not going to read through pages and pages of documentation because they can't, or it's going to take too long, right? So there's all those different things to go into it. You got to make it as simple as you possibly can. It's really what it boils down to.
Casey, I had a question for you. There's something that I've been noodling on. Is that working in like the firmware space specifically, and Larry, you can attest to this as well. I found that vendors, software manufacturers, hardware manufacturers that produce firmware, there seems to be this increasing trend where they don't have a bug bounty program and they're encrypting their firmware, which has a couple of, so from what a good friend of mine observed, and I think he's absolutely right, it accomplishes two things. One, it protects their intellectual property to prevent counterfeiting. The byproduct of that they're like, oh, that's a good thing too, is it prevents people from discovering bugs, or makes it harder, I should say, to discover bugs. My question for you is, how do we encourage folks that are producing firmware to have a bug bounty program that allows for a program for us to look at their particular firmware and disclose bugs responsibly to them, so that not all the onus is on them? I feel like they're not embracing the bug bounty program when they should be.
Yeah, I mean, I think firmware is a pretty good example, because they do have a bug bounty program. It's just being run by nation states.
Yeah.
This is true. That's real fun. Thank you.
True,
Thank
right?
you. Thank you very much.
It is true. And we've seen that trend this year. Tyler and I talked about that.
That's probably how I pitched that.
Yeah. And Tyler and I have talked about that, how network devices and appliances are coming under attack from nation states, from ransomware threat actors, for a whole host of reasons, right? One of those being is that firmware is really vulnerable because it has really old and easily discoverable vulnerabilities in it. So why not have a bug bounty program where we can flesh all this stuff out and you can fix it?
Exactly. So on top of it actually being actively used by adversaries, adversary, the bad guy bug bounty, so to speak, is actively funding research on discovering those vulnerabilities so that they can be recognized and used, and it's working. So therefore, why aren't you doing it too? To me, when it comes to the economics of bug bounty, and this is where I think vulnerable disclosure and bug bounty get a little bit tangled up, because I think vulnerable disclosure is more about just the physics of the internet and making sure information where it should, whereas bug bounty is about balancing out the economics and the resourcing between offense and defense. Different categories and different verticals are catching onto that idea at different points in time. I think one of the things for embedded devices, including things where firmware involved, is that their time to remediate and their time to deploy tends to be quite a bit longer. So they want to gate the amount of vulnerability information that they're having come in, which is not irrational. When you think about it, lightning's going to strike whenever the fuck it wants. So you're not actually controlling your threat model in that way. But as a business, when you're trying to think about how you control your remediation pipeline, it sort of does make some amount of sense. So I think just sort of balancing out those equities and making sure they understand that, ostrich risk management isn't a viable defensive strategy when it comes to product. That's just a true thing, but different people understand that.
It's the two sides of the same coin debate, right? In some respects, right? With firmware. And it goes back to our first segment where we're talking about supply chain, right? If we don't have open disclosure from a firmware perspective in the supply chain, then we fall into this trap of, do we deal with it? Don't we deal with it? Because am I responsible for it or not, right? Which is why I went back to Jeff's responsibility, accountability, liability, right? But disclosure, even at the firmware level, kind of hits at the heart of who's responsible, who's accountable, what's the liability.
Right.
And if we just flip a coin, we're at the mercy of the firmware providers to do this, not to the overall community to do this.
But also, Case, what
Yeah.
I'm hearing you say is by the lack of bug bounties in firmware. I don't know if you agree. Like, I observe this as there's a much less adoption in the firmware space to bug bounties than there are in many other areas of technology. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but
And
Yeah, no,
I won't say. I'm going to correct you and say not firmware, IoT, but I love the way Casey put it was
embedded devices. Yeah, he used an awesome. I love that term, embedded devices. Why did we get away from that term? I love it. Right, embedded devices. I think we're agreeing that less adoption in bug bounties, which now breeds this other market for if I find vulnerabilities here, I can go sell them to other nation states, and this is not a good situation.
I want to double back a little bit, and
the market just putting a bullet on that one. The marketplace or the market just in general for 0 day and end day in IoT, like prior to 2020, it was fairly quiet, and I'm talking about consumer stuff. So like, higher end's always been fairly active, but consumer IoT, ODA being sold off into offensive markets was fairly quiet until COVID hit, and then probably midway through 2020, things started flying off the shelves, and the reason for that is that the home environment became a predictable extension of the corporate network,
and all those researchers were stuck in their homes or were working from home with all of these consumer devices that they had easy targets.
I'm talking. So the supply was already there. I'm talking about the demand.
Good
point.
point.
Embedded's been a shit show for as long as I've been looking into it. It's a messy space, and it always has been. But like the demand for it and kind of the implied use of those types of exploits offensively by cyber criminals or nation states or whoever else that when wanting to keep away, that's gone and picked up quite a bit over the past 3 years.
Yep, because the enterprise became the consumer market.
Right.
Because of COVID.
Exactly.
I want to double back a little quick. Before you joined us, Casey, we started off with a discussion about vulnerability disclosure and when and how and who do you direct to. But I've always been kind of curious. I'm wondering if you have any insights or data points because of your bug crowd. What percentage of security researchers, and I use that term loosely, are good guys versus bad guys? I mean, I know you have a vetting program, but I have to think that there's a certain amount of people that are in the business for nefarious reasons. But I also kind of think that a lot of times we have these vulnerability disclosures, and it gets out in the public because of all the things we've talked about where it's not working talking to the vendor. But how many bad guys out there are doing the security research to the level that the quote unquote good guys are doing? Nation states sort of accepted. But what's your perception of how many of the bad guys that are just looking for a way to monetize and find something to exploit are actually doing the level of research that we sort of talk about that we're talking about here?
I want to ask Jeff a question in a slightly different way, because this is also a question that I have. Are the bad threat actors banking on our research that we're doing legitimately,
right,
or are the evil threat actors doing their own research, and what's the ratio?
Are they doing the research themselves, or are they waiting for us to publish full disclosure because the system
Black Hat's
didn't
happening,
work.
so I got to pay attention to everything,
Right.
and this is my next toolkit.
I mean, I think another trend that kicked off that was pretty visible and started midway through 2020 was nation state use of NDAY in an overt fashion. I think prior to that there'd been a lot more focus on stealth, and all of a sudden you've got China hosing half the internet for web shell and exchange and all the kind of remote access stuff that happened. So that's all off the back of not necessarily research that's been dropped, but like patch diffing. So when a patch gets dropped, they'll go off and diff it, and create an exploit off that, and just basically kind of count on the fact that there's going to be a deploy lag between when that information becomes available and when a patch can be deployed, and in that window they're going to have open season if they're hacking or targeting opportunistically, right? And what we've seen over the past 12 months with all of the the fancy new LLMs and AI tools that we've got available to play with now is that they're actually really good at helping folks doing patch diffing actually arrive at a working exploit. So that window between patch drop and active exploitation of Enday in the wild has dropped quite a bit and fairly predictably as well over the past little bit. So that sort of tells me that it's the bad guys taking advantage of the work of the good guys and co-opting it. That's the side that we can see as well, though. So the flip side, like to what degree are we seeing, like adversarial, research efforts result in things that we find out about later. Like there's been plenty of examples of that over the past while as well. Oh, we're patching this vulnerability because we've observed active exploitation in the wild. Like that happened. It's because the bad guy found it first. So yeah, I mean, to talk to it, in terms of like specific percentages or ratios, that's probably a bit more art than science, but like both happen.
I hate to cut the conversation short, but we're a little over on time. Casey, I want to thank you so much for on extremely short notice coming on our show and dropping knowledge and answering our questions. So I hope that we'll see each other very soon at a conference in January.
Come to ShmooCon.
Thanks for the invite. Cheers.
ShmooCon.
Thanks so much, Casey. With that, we'll take a short break and come back with the security news for this week. Stay tuned.